The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, certified mail with that official green return card that always means trouble. I was still in my pajamas, coffee halfway to my lips, standing in the kitchen of the house my grandfather built with his own hands on land he had owned since before my parents were born. I set the mug down and tore open the envelope. The letterhead was cold and corporate, the font lawyers use specifically to make ordinary people feel small. "Dear Miss Chen," it began, "this correspondence serves as official notice that the property located at 4758 Blackwood Lane is in violation of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association covenants, codes, and restrictions." I read it 3 times before the words fully landed. 30 days to comply, 30 days to tear down my grandfather's barn, 30 days to remove what they called unsightly agricultural structures and restore the property to residential standards, or face daily fines of $500. My hands were shaking by the time I set the letter on the counter, not from fear, from disbelief. The barn was not just a structure. It was where my grandfather had kept his workshop for 40 years, where he had taught me to build birdhouses when I was 7, where he had spent 3 years restoring a 1967 Mustang by hand, piece by piece, the way he did everything, slowly, carefully, and with complete devotion. It was the last piece of him I had left. He had passed away 8 months earlier and left me everything: the house, the land, the barn, the half-finished projects inside it. And these people, with their identical beige houses and laminated rulebooks, wanted it gone because it did not match their aesthetic. I called my attorney, Tom Bradford, within the hour. Tom had known my grandfather personally and had handled the estate paperwork when I inherited the property 6 months earlier. The moment I told him what the letter said, his voice shifted into something careful and deliberate. "Sarah," he said slowly, "have you looked at your grandfather's property deed lately? The full survey?" I told him I had not. I had inherited everything, but had not had the heart to sit down with legal paperwork while still learning how to exist in a world without him. Tom told me to come to his office immediately and bring every document my grandfather had left regarding the land. 3 hours later, I was sitting across from Tom's desk, surrounded by yellowed documents, hand-drawn survey maps, and papers that smelled exactly like my grandfather's attic: old wood, dust, and decades of quiet history. Tom spread a large survey map across the desk and traced a thick red boundary line with his finger. "Sarah," he said finally, "your grandfather owned 1,000 acres. I stared at him. 1,000. I had known the property was large, but had never understood the full scope. Tom nodded and pulled out a second map showing the neat rows of the Meadowbrook Estates development: identical houses, a clubhouse, a community pool, tennis courts, and perfectly edged lawns in every direction. "Now look at where they built," he said. I followed his finger across the map, and then the air left my lungs completely. The entire Meadowbrook Estates development, all 247 homes, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, every manicured lawn, sat squarely within my grandfather's original property lines. Tom pulled out a document from 1998 and explained what had happened. My grandfather had sold 200 acres to a development company called Pinnacle Corporation. But the deed contained specific language Pinnacle had never taken seriously enough. The sale included a reversion clause, a legal provision stating that if Pinnacle violated certain terms, the land would revert back to my family automatically. One of those terms was a required 50-foot buffer zone around my grandfather's original 5-acre homestead. Tom pointed to 3 houses on the map. Houses 34, 35, and 36 were built directly inside the buffer zone. The violation had occurred during construction, and nobody had ever legally challenged it. "What does that mean?" I asked, though part of me already sensed the answer. Tom leaned back and said it plainly. It means those 200 acres legally reverted back to your grandfather's estate in 2003. He never pursued it. Probably did not want the fight at his age. But Sarah, you inherited all 1,000 acres. The HOA has no legal authority over your property. He paused. Actually, you have authority over theirs. I sat with that for a long moment. The HOA that had sent me a 30-day deadline to demolish my grandfather's barn had been operating on land that legally belonged to my family for over 20 years. Every fine they had issued, every rule they had enforced, every meeting held in that clubhouse, all of it on my land. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Saturday morning. I received the email Thursday night, a curt message informing me that my continued violation required immediate board attention and that my presence was mandatory. The tone assumed compliance before the first word was read. I spent Friday evening at Tom's office going through every document carefully and organizing everything into a leather portfolio. Tom reminded me that our goal walking in was not to destroy anyone. It was to make the legal reality undeniably clear and give the board a reasonable path forward. I walked into that clubhouse at 10 in the morning precisely, Tom beside me. The room was already full. Board members sat at a long table on a raised platform as though the elevation gave their authority additional weight. Homeowners filled chairs behind us, arms crossed, expressions set. Patricia Hendris sat at the center of the board table. HOA president, 4th consecutive term, composed and controlled, radiating the confidence of someone who had never once had the ground shift beneath them during one of these meetings. Miss Chen, she said, thank you for joining us. We are here to discuss your flagrant disregard for community standards. Actually, I said, setting my portfolio on the table. We are here to discuss your illegal occupation of my land. The room shifted instantly. Patricia's expression shifted. Not dramatically, she was too practiced for that, but something behind her eyes moved. Excuse me, she said. Tom stepped forward and laid the survey maps and deed documents on the table, one by one. Miss Chen is the legal owner of all 1,000 acres of the original Blackwood property, including the 200 acres this development sits on. The reversion clause was triggered in 2003 when Pinnacle violated the buffer zone requirement. Your HOA has been operating on her property without legal authority for over 20 years. You could have heard a single sheet of paper land in that room. Patricia's face moved from composed to red in seconds. That is completely ridiculous, she said. Every homeowner here holds a deed. Tom nodded calmly. You hold deeds issued by a developer who no longer owned the land when those deeds were written. The chain of title has a fundamental break. Miss Chen is prepared to resolve this cooperatively, but the legal reality must be understood first. A man in the back row stood up before Tom could continue. His face had gone the color of someone whose blood pressure had just made a significant decision. You cannot walk in here and threaten us, he said. We will sue. We have documentation. You have nothing. I looked at him steadily. You are welcome to pursue that, I said. But here is what I am offering instead, and this offer has a specific window. I am not here to displace 247 families. The homeowners in this room purchased their properties in good faith. That is not the dispute. The dispute is with the board and the authority it has been exercising over land it does not legally control. My terms are straightforward, I continued. The violation notice against my property must be formally rescinded within 24 hours. A written apology must be issued, and the HOA covenants must be permanently amended to exclude my original 5-acre homestead from all association restrictions, now and in perpetuity. Patricia was on her feet. Or what, she said, the courtesy veneer completely gone. I looked at her directly. or I invoke my full rights as the legal landowner of record. I can initiate proceedings to dissolve this HOA entirely and renegotiate every property deed in this development from the point of the original title break. I paused and let that settle before continuing. Or I simply begin charging ground rent at fair market value for every square foot of my land occupied by this association's common areas. Tom has calculated the community pool at approximately $15,000 per month. The tennis courts add another $8,000. The room came apart completely. People shouting, some standing, a woman near the front crying, two men simultaneously trying to get Tom's attention. Patricia stood with her hands pressed flat on the table and her mouth open, but nothing coming out. I waited until individual voices could be heard again. I am giving you 24 hours from this moment, I said. You gave me 30 days. I am giving you 24 hours. The choice is genuinely yours. Then I picked up my portfolio, nodded to Tom, and walked out into the clean morning air. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the old house settle and the crickets behind the barn, running through every possible scenario. Lawyers at my door, an emergency injunction, a coalition of angry homeowners organized into something requiring a longer fight than I had energy for. None of it happened. The house stayed quiet. The barn stood exactly where it had always stood. The crickets did not care about reversion clauses or HOA covenants or certified letters written in cold corporate fonts. At 9:47 the following morning, my email notification sounded. The message was from Patricia Hendris, sent on behalf of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA Board of Directors. Dear Miss Chen, after careful review and consultation with our legal counsel, the board has voted unanimously to rescind violation notice 202-40847 in its entirety, effective immediately. Furthermore, we are formally amending the Meadowbrook Estates covenants to permanently exclude the original Blackwood homestead property from all HOA jurisdiction and enforcement. This exclusion applies now and in perpetuity and will be recorded with the county within 10 business days. We apologize for any distress this matter may have caused. Sincerely, Patricia Hendris, President. I called Tom immediately. My voice was doing something unplanned, shaking slightly, not from distress, but from the physical release of tension I had been carrying for days without realizing its weight. They agreed to everything, I said. All 3 terms. He said he knew they would. They had no other viable path, and their lawyer had explained that within the first hour after our meeting. I stood at my kitchen window after hanging up and looked out at the barn. The morning light was hitting the old weathered wood at the angle that made it look like something worth painting, the kind of ordinary thing that turns out to be extraordinary once you understand what it has survived. My grandfather had built that barn before the surrounding land had any houses on it at all. He had worked in it through 4 decades of mornings and weekends and late evenings when a project had a hold of him. He had taught me patience in that barn. He had taught me that the most satisfying things in life require the most time. The HOA had looked at that barn and seen a code violation, an aesthetic disruption, an unsightly agricultural structure failing to conform to residential standards. They had sent a letter with a deadline and assumed a woman who had recently lost her grandfather would simply comply because compliance felt easier than resistance. They had not done their research. They had not looked carefully at the documents governing the land beneath their own feet. They had operated on the assumption that authority announced confidently enough functions as authority, regardless of whether it actually exists. That assumption had cost them 24 of the most uncomfortable hours in Patricia Hendris's 4th consecutive term. It had cost the board an emergency meeting, a legal consultation, a unanimous vote, and a formal written apology sent before 10 in the morning. It had cost me nothing except a sleepless night and the discovery that I was capable of walking into a room full of people who expected control and holding my ground without flinching. I had not known that about myself before that Saturday morning. My grandfather probably had. He always seemed to know things about me before I did. I went outside after finishing my second cup of coffee and stood in front of the barn with my hand on the old wooden door. The wood was warm from the morning sun. The hinges were original, slightly stiff, requiring the particular sideways lift he had taught me when I was small enough that the door felt enormous. Inside, the 1967 Mustang sat exactly where he had left it, partially restored, partially still in pieces, waiting with the patience of something that understands it has time. His tools hung on the wall in the precise order he kept them. His workbench still had the coffee ring from the last morning he had stood there, working. I was going to finish that Mustang, not because I knew everything about restoring a classic car. I did not. But because he had started it, and it deserved to be finished. And I had 1,000 acres and as much time as the project required. Somewhere in the neighborhood behind me, Patricia Hendris was at her window, processing the 24 hours that had just passed, recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the authority she held and the ground it stood on. I did not feel satisfaction about her discomfort. I felt something quieter, something that had more to do with my grandfather than with her. He had stood on this land through every kind of season and never walked away from a fight that found him. He had taught me that the difference between people who get pushed around and people who do not is almost always just the willingness to know what you are standing on and refuse to move. He had left me more than 1,000 acres and a half-restored Mustang. He had left me the understanding that some things are worth the sleepless night, that research matters, that a person who knows the actual facts will almost always outlast a person who only knows how to sound certain. The barn was going to stay, the land was going to stay, and the next time a certified letter arrived with a cold corporate font and a deadline built on the assumption that I did not know what I owned, I would already be reaching for the phone before finishing the first line. Some lessons you carry from the people who loved you. Some you earn in a meeting room on a Saturday morning with a leather portfolio and 20 years of legal history spread across a table. The best lessons are the ones where both of those things happen at exactly the same time.